Hello friends, welcome to AI Flux. Today we're talking about Stable Studio. So this is a open source version of DreamStudio, at least in its implementation, released by Stability AI. There are a number of interesting reasons why this is kind of a new trend, especially among LLMs, which is interesting because that happened pretty far after Stability AI released sort of the first generative image models like Stable Diffusion. And the founder of Stability AI, Mod, has given some details as to why they've done this and what their real objective is. Later in this video, we'll go over sort of the economics of why this is a direction that Stability AI wants to take. So this is the release page. It's pretty cool. It doesn't really go into too much detail, but it covers what their overall announcement. So basically they say Stability AI is thrilled to announce Stable Studio, the open source release of our premier text-to-image consumer application, DreamStudio. Stable Studio marks a fresh chapter for our imaging pipeline and showcases Stability AI's dedication to advancing open source development within the AI ecosystem. I think it's important to note that the notion of quote-unquote open source at Stability AI and even just Hugging Face is kind of an interesting one because, like many of you know, to have Stable Diffusion locally, you still have to have an API key from Hugging Face. So there's still strings attached. And what's interesting is, and even according to a mod, the actual back end of Stable Diffusion XL and what is behind this more recent studio release is not actually open source yet. You can license it and you can use it. It's why when you look into how you use this, you actually still have to have an API key. So in time, maybe they'll make them entirely open. This is a greater part of the safety debate going on with generative AI that's very much ongoing, and it'll be interesting to see kind of how this changes in the future. So they're big on mentioning that since the original release of Stable Diffusion, DreamStudio has served as Stability AI's primary interface. And the interface part is important here because most of what is open sourced right now is actually just the interface. It's the infrastructure that actually interacts with the model and shows it to you and makes that possible in a local fashion. So basically they're saying, you know, the interface is important. And in the way that this application was first conceived as a platform to bring generative AI to the masses, so like non-technical people, then they get into open source, which the meat of this really is in the GitHub repo, because that's where they go over what this release really contains. In terms of their overall goals, I think this is pretty telling. They say, our goal is to work with the broader community to create a world-class user interface for generative AI, which many who've used Stable Diffusion would probably say, well, you know, Automatic1111 or Automatic is just generally a pretty good option, right? Like the developer experience is great. The community around it is very strong. Curiously enough, they're very big on saying for generative AI, which users fully control, which brings them to the MIT license page, which I think is kind of funny because it's a pretty restrictive open source license. They also mentioned that they've shimmed in a Disk Diffusion plugin, so you can generate images with their stable LLM. And what I think is most interesting is where they talk about kind of the future of Stable Studio. And this is cool to get into because most people will look at these open source models and say, oh, this is crazy. Like they're really just going to give away all this hard work. What's to gain from that? And I think Facebook leaking Llama, and whether you think that was intentional or actually an accident is sort of beside the point. But the point is when stuff is open source, you get to leverage a ton of work for free and you can license it properly. And if you play nicely, you get huge speed ups and innovation you couldn't even hire teams to dream about as all part of this greater community. And what we're finding as AI continues to grow, at least in the generative image space, the battle of models is now becoming a battle of platforms. And by platforms, I mean how users interact, how users and developers interact with models that generate text, that generate audio, that generate anything. And open sourcing is a great way to speedrun this. It's a great way to just see things done in ways that your internal engineering team probably would not have initially thought about. So two big things here. The biggest is WebGPU. So for those of you who don't know, WebGPU is a new standard that makes it possible to leverage your local GPU for compute in the browser. So think of taking Automatic1111, right, which is something you run like a backend for, and you're just taking the backend that is providing you a web page that lets you interact with a ML model that uses your GPU on your machine, and you're taking the backend part and just putting that in the cloud. So what's cool about this is it means there's less risk for people who have models that they want to distribute. I'm all about everyone being able to contain their own models, but beside the point, it makes it easier for people to use this. It also makes the setup process and the tooling much easier. And the biggest thing, and Google is really careful to not really admit this, but using GPUs in the cloud is pretty hard, predominantly because of availability. And even in Google Colab, there are portions of time regularly when there are no A100s available. Even if you go to paid providers, a lot of them just have all their GPUs being used and they can't scale enough for availability. So the cool thing with this is it sort of helps that problem in a bit of a different way. They also mentioned desktop installation, which of course it's local, so why would you not be able to do that? And it's open source. Control net tools. And if there's stuff you want them to do, you can even tell them that yourself. The real meat of this, I think, is in the GitHub repo. This is kind of like, the same thing here. What's interesting is the entire front end they've written is all in Node. It's modern enough. I think it's kind of cool. And hopefully that means better performance, but we will just have to wait and see. We'll have another video with me using this and comparing it to Automatic1111. They highlight some differences here, and this is sort of the biggest tell of their recent development. So basically, at a high level, there's just not much of a difference. There are a few tweaks that they made to make the project more community-friendly. They removed the DreamStudio specific branding since it makes it feel kind of corporate. All the over-the-wire API calls have been replaced by a plugin system, which is pretty huge. So this allows you to easily swap out the backend to whatever you want. So this is sort of the shot across the bow for Automatic1111 because they have a similar kind of plugin program, but it relies heavily on every time something new comes out, a ton of retooling being done by the community behind Automatic1111 and their core developers. On release, they'll only be providing a plugin for the stability API, but with TypeScript, you can add your own for other models. They also removed the stability-specific account features. What's interesting is with this push that they're clearly making for open source, it doesn't really look like much else is being open sourced alongside it, including the model itself. Again, Stable Diffusion XL, in theory, is going to be open sourced soon. This is probably a licensing issue tied to AI safety. Something that's kind of interesting, if you want to read into it, is something called the OpenRailM license. And what's interesting is, although open is in the name of the license, it doesn't really conform to the OSI definition of what open source is, which is sort of a body that says, you can't say something's open source when it kind of isn't. The irony is that they claim that their models are open source too, but ironically, their own license violates several points of the open source definition in general. So now the question comes up of, so Stability is open sourcing all this stuff. They charge for DreamStudio, but they don't charge for anything else. How are they planning on making any money from this? So Imad has a tweet that kind of goes into this, where he mentions this here. So he says, "This is our business model for folk that keep asking. Stable models are a benchmark of open source of every modality based on open data. We'll have sectoral/commercially licensed ones via our partners, for example, AWS to your data. We also build custom models for the largest customers and governments." So this is another interesting take on the on-prem sort of bespoke model. And what's interesting is with all of the progress in open source LLMs, that's already breaking this model, which is kind of interesting. The open source play is also an interesting one to play into the hand of VCs. It's kind of the next logical step we all kind of saw coming. So I think this is pretty cool. The developer trends for me are the most interesting parts of this. If you plan on contributing or if you plan on building on top of this, let me know. If you think it's better than Automatic1111, leave a comment. And as always, I hope you learned something here. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks.